Well, hi everyone. I might get started. My name is Professor Winifred Lewis. I'm the chair today, and I'm so excited to welcome you to the 2026 PEPS round. And I want to thank Christine, who is here today, and invite everyone to give a round of applause for wrestling with our new AP system, which has been, I'm sure, an amazing technological upgrade, but also a learning curve for us here at the University of Queensland. Very steep. So I'll also begin by acknowledging country. Along with the University of Queensland, we acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands that we're meeting on today. And I extend my respects to elders, past and present, and to people in the room today or in the virtual room. We pay our respects to ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connection to country and recognize their ongoing leadership in Australia and around the world on this topic, and breaking through the silos, breaking through the narrow lens that has hobbled our scholarship and our practice in engaging this complex issue. I'm excited to welcome two speakers today, and for those that don't know our PEPS format, it is a dialogical and interactive interdisciplinary seminar series. So first, we'll hear from Associate Professor Sarah Moulds, a professor of law, and then we'll hear from Divna Haslam, a clinical psychologist, and each will speak for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then each will reflect for around 5 minutes on the other presenters' talk, and then we'll go to a panel discussion and really look forward to your questions and to our conversation on this important topic. So I'll just click through to another slide, though, to note that we are recording today and it'll go up on YouTube. If you prefer not to be recorded, you can leave your video off and post your questions in the chat. We will post it on our PEPSS Seminar page as well, slightly out of date, but we are on the verge of breaking through to update that again. And we also would invite you, if you'd like to be added to the PEPSS mailing list, just to reach out to our team. So everything okay on the tech side? Okay. So we'll begin, Sarah, by inviting you to share your slides, and I'll stop sharing mine. And while Sarah's doing that, I'll just give you a brief introduction. So Sarah is an associate professor of law at Adelaide University, specializing in public law, human rights, legislation, and administrative law. She's the co-founder of the Rights Resource Network of South Australia and the author of Committees of Influence, a leading work on parliamentary rights scrutiny. Her research focuses on connecting communities with parliaments and strengthening accountability, including her Churchill Fellowship, exploring how to empower young people in parliamentary engagement. She has held senior laws in law reform, including at the Law Council of Australia and the Southern Australian Law Reform Institute. She is the editor of Australasian Parliamentary Review and the deputy chair of the International Parliamentary Engagement Network. Thanks so much for coming along, Sarah, and sharing your wisdom. Can't wait to hear from you.
Thank you so much. I'm really, really honoured to be here talking to you today, and on this theme of what do we know and what do we not know about ending intergenerational violence, abuse and trauma. And I just wanted to acknowledge the country from which I join you, which is Ghana land here in Adelaide, and pay my respects to elders past and present who are the traditional owners of the Adelaide University campus that I work on, and I'm joining you from here. And I would like to pay my respects to First Nations elders and any other Aboriginal person who is watching or engaging with this recording. I guess what I wanted to start with is my reflections on being involved in any interdisciplinary experiences when it comes to this question of violence, and those interactions with other disciplines on this question of violence and intergenerational violence has exposed to me the deep and significant limits of the law as a framework for understanding violence and responding to violence. And it's also opened my eyes, I guess, to the possibility of a response that doesn't centre law when it comes to thinking about how we might create a community or society that is free from the cycle of intergenerational violence. Also, the experience I've had working with other colleagues from other disciplines has shown me that the law is still a powerful and useful tool for thinking about normative change in our communities, and that is really important for addressing this question of intergenerational violence and for developing and deepening our understanding of what it means and how we might respond to it. So I guess what I'm saying is that I've had a legal training that's given me a lens for looking at this issue. I've engaged in my own research that attempts to elevate and centre the experience of people who have lived through and engaged with different systems designed to respond to intergenerational violence. And through that process, I've come up with findings that I think do have utility because they point to changes we could make in the law, but also I've come up with a deeper understanding, which is that my work and my training and my conceptualization of what violence is perhaps limiting the potential possibilities for understanding the phenomenon better and therefore developing the kind of responses that might work. So my starting point is one of gratitude and humility to the opportunity to interact with other disciplines, and in particular to have engaged in the mapping project that we did together for Social Change Lab and other colleagues. That really was an opportunity to position my own understanding next to others and to see what happens when we take a broader view. And similarly, I think today is the opportunity to position myself in that standpoint of listener and learner. But I wanted to share with you, I guess, the frame that law brings to thinking about violence, and that is centering the state, as you can see on this slide here. So when the law tries to understand what violence is, it sees it through the lens of the state, and it sees the state as the prosecutor, the body, the institution that bears the burden of proving a breach of the law. And it does this from the position of saying the offender has breached a norm that's important to all of us, therefore the state responds. It responds with some kind of punitive measure to disincentivize that conduct in the future. And as soon as this happens, the kind of characters are determined in the eyes of the state in a way that's binary and very significant for any other experience that the individuals who embody these characters are going to have as they move through the legal system and the justice system's response to violence. And the other thing that the law does is it looks to delineate action from mindset, and it can only really cope with a slice of time at once. Now, what do I mean by action from mindset? The law looks to say someone's done a wrongful act, and it looks to isolate that act and adjudicate its merits. So this is hitting somebody or saying something or, stealing something, breaking a window. That's the kind of act that looks at, and it says, is that act right or wrong? And then it puts that next to the mindset of the person, the intention of the person, what they meant when they did that action. And it looks to decide whether that mindset is right or wrong. And it puts those two things together in determining whether violence has occurred or the type of violence that requires a punitive response from the state. And because of the law approaching the question of violence in this way, we see that the character of the quote unquote victim, and I'm putting that in quotes not because I'm trying to undermine the significance of the position of someone who's suffered harm, but more because of the way that it characterizes an individual in the system as a victim, is sidelined from this system because it is ends up being an institutional dialogue between the state and the perpetrator. And for me, this gives some clarity and accountability to what we mean when we talk about violence, or what we might begin to think of when we talk about responding to intergenerational violence. But it is very narrow and limiting, and it positions all of us in a certain relationship with the state and a system that can really compromise our creativity and our humanity, I would argue, in responding. And it's only when we push on aspects of that system that we see its perhaps more holistic potential to offer the type of norm change that we might need to break the cycle of intergenerational violence. And so for me, this realization was underscored by the mapping activity that a piece of, I don't know if you can see my Teams chat now, I don't know how to turn that off, sorry. The mapping activity that we were part of, that you can see here, a little snapshot on the screen, where we were able together through this interdisciplinary experience begin to question and test and reconceptualize the role of the state and the role that the state might play in both responding to perpetuating intergenerational violence, but also to unpack what the state is, to understand that the state is not a monolithic, that we're talking about collectives of people, of humans for whom their own lived experience, their own ability to understand and relate to individuals who are experiencing violence or to perpetrators that might also have experienced violence is critical to thinking about what the state is and therefore the state's role in the system. And so for me, this was transformative, just to see the way that different disciplines articulate this, and to, I guess, reimagine where responsibility and interventions might lie. And these findings that came out of the mapping project that focus on the idea of violence as being sustained through interconnected feedback loops of trauma, disempowerment, and service failures that reinforce across generations, the idea that we need a multi-level coordinated response, and that the process of understanding what this is also the process of understanding what the solution is. This resonated so strongly with me, both from my practice before academia and when I worked in the courts, and I sat for many hours in court proceedings, and being able to see what happens to individuals who are sentenced or going through criminal trials, and the research that I referred to before that involved qualitative research with individuals who had been through the legal system, in particular individuals who are seeking legal orders to protect themselves and their families from domestic violence. So this rung true because in both of those contexts, it was clear that the victim-perpetrator binary was not something that was likely to assist in the holistic solution to responding to the type of violence the law was attempting to condemn and to disincentivize in the system. But equally, that the normative power of the law was important, and that whenever we tried to push on the limits of those binaries, we saw something new that we could work with in all of those contexts. And that was because the people who embodied the position of the state were empowered enough to articulate a new way of conceptualizing what the state was, what their responsibility was, and what kind of intervention they could use to respond to violence in a different way. So it was almost like when they stepped outside of the binds that the formal law had put them in, that they were able to advance a solution. And once that became visible to others, the law was able to be amended to catch up with that kind of thinking. And so I guess what I found through participating in the mapping process is that there's still a lot that we don't know, definitely much that I don't know. And there's a temptation, perhaps this comes from my legal training as well, to want to look at what systematic reforms, what legislative reforms and structural kind of norm changes do we need to make immediately to respond to these kind of findings. but the mapping process would actually pull in a different direction, which is actually there's more and deeper questions we must ask first, and there's more and different voices we must include in this process before we can begin to see where the right kind of interventions would lie. And also the preliminary findings, I think, would suggest that it's going to be a multi-layered interventional response that maybe has within it a humility to recognise that perhaps each of us have a tendency to look for our own power base as being the central place for change, when in fact it might come from a different voice. So I guess to me, when I reflect on the mapping project and put it next to the research that I've been involved in on the question of intergenerational violence, this is kind of what comes out for me, that we need systems literacy that extends beyond individual disciplines. And I think Divna's presentation is so powerful around this theme as well. But we also need to retain a close eye on the question of accountability. And that's because of this nexus between accountability and healing. And in discourses that are familiar to me, I guess this might begin to emerge in ideas of restorative justice, because restorative justice is an example of what I was talking about before, where individuals within the state system step outside the tight binds that are given to them by the legislature or the judiciary and attempt a different way at communicating justice that sits more closely to what the humans they're interacting with are hoping for. And as we see the benefits of that and how they can actually strengthen accountability rather than pose a threat to accountability, they can be embraced by the state and other parts of the system. And that's what we have seen with some, different approaches to the adversarial response to judicial proceedings in some contexts. I think that there is a role for statutory reform and norm change. And we see this, say, with the discussion around a law like coercive control, which is such an interesting case study for me and something I've also done research on. The reason it's very interesting to me is because even the idea of coercive control, the idea of attempting to criminalise a pattern of behaviour, really pulls against what I was talking about right on my first slide. It pulls against the focus on the wrongful act and the wrongful mind as if they're the same thing. Instead, if we look to criminalise coercive control, what we end up talking about is a pattern of behaviour that isn't wrongful of itself, but is wrongful in its context. And to give an example of that, that you would, I'm sure, be familiar, if one person is at the front of Coles every single day at the same time, that's not a crime, nor should it be. But if that person is doing that every single day because they know their partner goes shopping at Coles, and they're doing that to indicate a sense of coercion over their partner, then that is something that we don't want to encourage. The state wants to discourage that and recognise that as a harmful thing. But the law finds it difficult to do that with clarity. And so that's why I think when we have a debate often around the quality or effectiveness of a particular legal response, without thinking about these things that have been shared with me through this interdisciplinary work, we can have a skewed view on what good looks like, and we can, in our attempt to provide legal clarity and systems literacy, we can lose those other parts of what we're trying to do, which is the accountability and community-led healing. And so I think that is a challenge that I'm looking forward to continuing to embrace with others as part of this work. And I just thought I'd leave with this slide around the Intervention Orders Act, which is the work that I've been doing in South Australia Intervention orders are sometimes in different jurisdictions, different parts of Australia called AVOs, apprehended violence orders, or domestic violence orders. These are preventative orders that are actually civil in nature, which means they can be obtained on the balance of probabilities by someone who has a reasonable basis to fear violence. But once they are breached, they have criminal consequences for the person who breaches those orders. And to me, this is a really good example of where, the state is attempting to prevent violence. And so we can see a shift in the mindset of the state as a monolithic, if we like. Many generations ago, it would not be seeking to prevent, it would be seeking only to respond to something that's happened. But yet we see it is kind of bound up in that binary. So it's not particularly good at prevention because it sets a range of barriers in place for the person to have to overcome before they can get the protection of the state. And it immediately positions the defendant, the person for whom they're looking to separate, in a position of guilt. In a perpetrator position as someone who should be rejected by the community and somebody who might be subject to a punitive response before they have actually done something that would transgress the concepts that I talked about before. And so this positioning really limits then the rest of our imaginative and evidence-based responses to the problem, because it creates a trap, if you like, from being able to see the individuals in a holistic way that better enables us to reach those goals of accountability and healing, in my view anyway. And so, I think what I'm super interested in is how to use what I've learned through the mapping experience, from what I'm learning from other disciplines, to try and encourage legislators and lawmakers to create space to have these conversations, and then to be creative about making sure that we remember what the law does well. And what the law does well is it sets a normative standard and gives us a shared language to talk about what's important for us. And it can be a place where the individuals involved in the state systems can show innovation, and the law does have a capacity to catch up. And so that's kind of my hopeful idea, that if we can create space within the justice system for individuals to be free to innovate, then maybe we can get the law out of the way so the other disciplines can show us what healing and accountability looks like. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
I have to turn the audio on.
I did, yeah. Thank you. Thanks very much, Sarah, and really appreciated that. I'm sure you have a lot of questions. I welcome everyone in the Zoom and invite you to put your questions in the chat. But just to remind you, if you're not familiar with the PEPSS format, that will now go straight on to Professor Divna Haslam's presentation, and then there'll be some reflection between the speakers before we get to your questions. So just to manage your expectations. Before I turn it over to Divna, or would you like to share slides from your device?
No, that's fine.
Yeah, okay. So maybe I'll move away from the mic. I believe you can still hear me, but let me know if you can't, Zoomers. So while Divna is setting up, she tells me she doesn't want me to brag about her at great length, so we'll just hit a few key highlights. So Divna is a clinical psychologist, and she's been a luminary of child maltreatment research here at the University of Queensland, working with the Queensland Centre for Mental Health Research, as well as the parenting group here, our very large and impactful Triple P network. And her work is at the nexus of parenting, family functioning, and early childhood adversity, and is driven by the goal of ensuring children have access to loving, stable, and violence-free childhoods. And as a result, like many practitioners, Over time, Divna has moved towards policy impact and has worked with the Queensland Child Death Review Board, as well as the World Health Organization, and is a director of the Parenting and Family Research Alliance. So over to you, Divna. Thank you for being here.
I might just need you to share my
Okay, well,
things. I think we might have to.
we continue to have technical glitches here, folks, so thanks for your patience.
So this is okay. It's not that one. Yeah.
You need to do share screens.
Okay. All right. And then, so do you think it's I think it's this one? Sorry, I'm just letting out you.
All right, something cool is happening.
All right.
Fantastic. Yes,
Can we see?
we can see. Yeah,
All right.
we.
Are we scrolling through?
I am not scrolling through. Oh, yes, we are. Yeah.
Okay, here we go. All right. So
Do you need to go to the presentation? It's still not projecting to our screens, but it is coming through on the Zoom.
yeah, that's okay. I think it's fine.
Okay.
Okay. So as long as you can see.
We can see on the Zoom, we can see this slide, what do we know and not know about intergenerational transmission of violence?
Look, I'm coming at this from a family point of view. Every child that experiences violence, and that is 62% of Australian children have experienced some level of violence, has some level of impact. The extent of that impact depends on multiple things, including who the child is, their context, how they grow up. But I guess just to situate this talk, particularly on the end of Sarah's, I'm going to take a more personal view in looking at what happens to a child who's innocent, comes into the world loving, that then makes them grow up to engage in violence and become a perpetrator of violence, and how that transmits intergenerationally. So Sarah, I was really touched in the binary of perpetrator victim, because there's not a binary. Is most of these victims are the ones that are growing up to be perpetrators. I think we'll be very hard pressed to find someone that uses violence that has not experienced it. This slide is a submission to the Queensland Child Law Reform. Can you see the slide? Yeah.
Yep.
To the Queensland Child Law Reform Commission, when we were looking at trying to change the laws around corporal punishment. And Sarah talked about the idea of laws being an opportunity to set social norms and change behaviours. And corporal punishment is a kind of nice example of that, because it's very common. It's common in Australia, it's common internationally, but it is, in fact, quite harmful. It's one of the early forms of violence that continues to persist and continues to influence people's perceptions of violence as acceptable behaviour. It influences children's perceptions of willingness to use violence as a solution, and by extension then influences their willingness to actually enact violence upon other people. So if we're thinking about how do we stop intergenerational patterns, the law and the systems which we'll kind of get back out to are really critical, but it starts at that kind of family home dynamic. And it's not just Sarah, you and I, and the other kind of social change lab people that are pushing it, but children are asking for change. You know, if we're watching the media, we're seeing what's happening and people saying this is not good enough. Their things need to change because this is not acceptable for children, even without thinking about what happens over time. But somehow there's a bit of a disconnect between the young children that everyone would agree is a victim, and then suddenly when that same child becomes a perpetrator of violence in adolescence, then there's the lock them up attitude among far too many politicians, I would argue. And so what I'm hoping to kind of do in this presentation is look at what are those pathways, I suppose, and rather than seeing here's a perpetrator and here's a victim, what are the kind of trajectories that children can go on? So what do we know and what do we not know? The answer, of course, is a lot, a little bit, and it depends. So there's no clear answers. I'll probably raise questions, but I'll present kind of overall summaries. I also would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're all meeting. I'm in the Turrbal and Yuggera lands here in Meanjin in Brisbane. This is a painting from my father's collection, done by a local Indigenous man in New South Wales, Lightning Ridge, and I kind of like it because it talks about the importance of family and country, which I think is really what this comes down to. In my background in child protection, Indigenous kids are vastly overrepresented in the system, about 12 to 17%, and that perpetuates intergenerationally. To give you an example, I was listening to someone speak about one of his clients in casework in child protection, and he was saying, wow, I really hope when I grow up, my children have a different experience of child protection. Not a different experience and a better experience that they don't go into child protection, but I hope they have a better experience of child protection than I did. And to me, that's heartbreaking. And that kind of speaks to this intergenerational trauma that happens because people don't have hope. The systems are not supporting them the way that they should. The laws are not supporting them the way that they should either. And over time, the story that I heard kind of went that he moved from, I hope my children have a different experience in child protection, to I actually hope my children aren't involved in child protection. And I work with people that are the first in their generation not to be involved in child protection. So I just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians and the kind of intergenerational trauma that occurs, and also those with lived and living experience of violence. And as I said before, that's 62% of us. About 40% of us have grown up in homes where there have been violence. And that impact occurs across generation. We know, for example, that young people that are brought up in homes of violence are more likely to be bullied, they're more likely to have mental health problems, and they're more likely to be disadvantaged across life. And going back to Sarah's comment about coercive control, that's a non-physical form of violence. And actually our new research that's just coming out of the Australian Child Maltreatment Study is showing that coercive control is actually one of the most damaging forms of violence. So even when a child is raised in a home where they are witnessing one of their parents coercively controlling the other, there's no physical discipline because we statistically control for that, but they are growing up, there's no violence towards the child, they are still more likely to have mental health problems and to be victimised in other areas of life. So that's the kind of broader context. And I think that's also the human story that's here. So I'm going to move on to talking about some of the theories and what we know and the predictors, but all of those are really people. And so it's not here's the checklist that we can look at, it's where does the child fit within this? And one of the things that I was really thinking about in Sarah's presentation, and I'll come back to this, is that it's not just a single pattern. So when we're thinking about what are the predictors of violence, there's not a checklist that we can say, if you have X, Y, Z, you are going to become violent. What we know is that there are things that will increase someone's risk or propensity to engage in violence. And of course, a checklist would be lovely. The child protection groups that I work with have checklists and risk assessments and all of those things. They actually don't work particularly well because there's a certain kind of artful magic in working out when risk really exists. So, for example, we know that choking a woman is a very high predictor of subsequent violence and murder, but other forms are not so predictive. So we could say, well, here we go, choking, if someone's done that, let's lock them up or let's deal with that. But it's not as simple as that because there are a lot of people that will engage in that behaviour that don't go on to murder their partners. So I've kind of broken it down into 3 key areas, and these kind of interplay with each other as well. So the early childhood and life, past parenting is a huge predictor across all studies, across all meta-analyses. The way that parents interact with children has a huge influence on how they develop in childhood, but also right across life. So when we're looking at how parents are interacting, that is an opportunity for intervention. So if we're thinking about what do we do to prevent violence, it's not once they've already perpetrated. It's not once they are actually at risk of perpetrating violence. We really need to be starting very early. We need to be thinking, what can we do to prevent kids from getting on this cycle? And one of those, of course, is the parenting. Maltreatment and adversity, of course, we know that disadvantages kids right across life. About 30 to 50% of children that experience maltreatment will go on to maltreat their own children. Now that, I've got the big asterisk at the top, is not causal. We don't necessarily know that if you were victimised as a child, you will victimise your own children. But we do know that without interventions, without healing, without restoring balance, regulation and so forth, the risks are very high. In the child protection system, being involved in care experiences is particularly high. So children that have been removed from their families are much more likely to have their children involved in child protection and removed. Domestic and family violence, of course, other disadvantages like poverty. So the inequity and the social determinants of violence occur right across the lifespan. So if you take a child who's in a disadvantaged neighbourhood who also has harsh parenting, because those parents are trying to balance a lot of things, their own regulation is not great, they're more likely to then act out and abuse their children. But that doesn't occur in a vacuum either. That occurs because of their history. You know, we've got these kind of intergenerational traumas, we've got their own childhood issues. So it's really about cascading impacts of violence over an individual's lifespan and then intergenerationally. And in the parenting field, in corporal punishment, in the harsh parenting, we see very similar things. So how you're parented without change or intervention tends to be repeated across the next generation. So you're more likely to have similar attitudes to parents and similar behaviour strategies. The other thing that we're starting to see and know more about is how these environmental factors interplay with the internal factors. So some are not changeable, so there are some sex differences, but things like the attachment style are influenced by the family environment. There are neurobiological changes that happen. Exposure to stress, particularly repeated exposure to stress, has epigenetic change responses. So children that grow up not knowing if mum or dad is going to lose it, start yelling, start throwing things, walking on eggshells, their physiology changes. And those gene expressions are transmitted across generations. So when we're thinking about intervening in a family, we're actually changing the course of that family's lineage, I suppose. And I've got a really interesting paper about epigenetic change and maltreatment. If you're interested in that, I'm happy to share. And then mental health and stress. So all of these internal factors play a role and interact with societal factors. So you imagine the child that's grown up, they've been disadvantaged, they've perhaps been abused, they can go through different courses. Some of those children actually have really good attachment. They might have a grandparent that comes in, or their parents get support and change, cultural connection and things are enhanced. Violence doesn't continue. Healing happens, you get psychological support, you have school connections, things can totally change. On the flip side, you get those kids that get disengaged from school, they're not connected in other contexts, and things cascade in that kind of negative way, and they're the ones that are more likely to engage in violence and end up in juvenile systems. And the broader societal attitudes also play a role, because that changes how we think about things. And to go back to that kind of corporal punishment example, when we did research, what we're seeing now is that fewer young people endorse the need to corporally punish your children or physically hit their children, which I would call as a form of abuse, but anyway, definitely a form of violence, than older people. So there's generational shifts in norms. In Australia, it's still completely legal to hit your children. Historically, it was completely legal to hit your wife, as long as you were teaching her. Something was for chastisement. That's the same kind of laws that we have for children. As those change in countries where they have changed, we do see changes in the expression of that form of violence. So the legislation and the regulation changes law, but it also changes how people interact. It's not a perfect system, and Sarah, I'm sure, would agree that we kind of need to do multiple things. She was touching on that already. The man box, just a plug there. If you haven't heard of this is really interesting social norm stuff about masculinity that's coming out and what young men are thinking, and men are thinking in general, and how that interacts with forms of violence. So is it okay to control what your wife wears or what your girlfriend wears? Is it important to be strong for your family? That kind of dysfunctional thinking. And then the kind of wraparound services and support. So the law Sarah was talking about can serve as a system of support. There are a whole host of other regulatory bodies that actually are mandated to provide protection and safety for children that consistently fail. We've just done a review into the system responses to child sexual abuse called In Plain Sight with the Family and Child Commission. please go and read that. What you will see in that is that the blue card system doesn't work because the criminal thresholds are quite different to the risk thresholds. And all the systems kind of work in silo. And so what that means is that we don't have the interconnected systems that actually work to both prevent, respond, and react to violence before it occurs and when it occurs. And that's, I think, the broader issue in terms of what perpetuates this cycle across time. Running out of time a bit. Okay, just a comment, exposure is not destiny. I'm very conscious that many of us in this room and online will have experienced some of these forms of maltreatment. Most of us will have been smacked as a child. I know I certainly was. It was normative when I was growing up, less so now. But the key message here is your past does not predict your future. If you are listening online and you're saying, oh my gosh, this is me and this is really quite terrifying, I want my children to have a better life than I had, I am telling you today there is hope, there is opportunity, and you can change the direction of your life and your child's life. So if you're in that room, please reach out and get support. And if the services fail you, like they have failed many, keep asking, because one of the big issues, I think, with the system stuff, when we kind of come back to that, is they are really hard to navigate. They're enormously difficult to navigate. And the people that need to navigate them usually don't have the resources to easily navigate them. I've had to navigate kind of wills and probates and law stuff recently, and that is enormously hard. And I would say I'm a normally competent person. And so I kind of think, well, how do you navigate all of these systems and stand up for your rights? Because as Sarah said, the law and the systems and the regulatory bodies are working for themselves rather than for you. They want to tick off boxes. And so it's about finding a way to make sure that you're advocating for your needs. All right. So how do these changes take place? So in psychology, we'd call these, what are the mechanisms of transfer? So why does experiences of violence in one generation impact experiences of violence in another? And I've kind of touched on some of these already, but there are a number of different theories that we can kind of unpack. A lot of it will come down to parenting. I know I'm kind of banging on about it, but for me, it just seems to be one of the things that is the easiest to possibly change, and yet something that nobody ever invests in. At the end, when I talk about what we don't know, the biggest issue is we don't know how to get governments to invest in the change that is required. We do have some good evidence of what might work and what might make a difference, but taking a long-term prevention approach is enormously difficult. Changing laws is enormously difficult. Setting up new statutory bodies that are actually mandated with looking after children or families or victims of domestic violence is enormously difficult. We're making progress, but it's challenging. So we really need to kind of look at what are the low-hanging fruit, I suppose. What are the things that we can get easy wins on while we continue to work away at those more challenging difficulties and the intersections between things which are particularly difficult. The social learning principles are a really key thing. So children learn a lot through the way that they see others interact. When they see mum or dad use violence as a coping tool, when they see mum or dad use alcohol or substance use, that teaches them that's an acceptable way to handle things. Monkey see, monkey do. And I've added monkey accept because it's not just that it changes our behaviour, but it changes our perceptions and our norms, and that it then influences our behaviour over time. So another example, of course, is someone's growing up in a home where there is family violence, I've said is more likely to engage in family violence themselves because that's what they've seen. And from a victim point of view, they're more likely to do that because they think that's an appropriate way. That's what happened to mum. That's just normal. And my dad, as a personal story, is from Croatia, and have quite traditional worldviews. And my mum had a Croatian friend when I was little, and she had mum had a black eye for something. She literally had walked into the door or something, and the friend said to her, "We just don't know when to be quiet, do we?" And it was just captured how normative this woman thought the violence was, is that it didn't even occur to her that this bruise could have come from something else. Now, Dad hadn't done anything to mum, but it really stuck with me because that's the experience of many women. And I say women deliberately because women are primarily the victims of this, but not always. There's, as I said, the neurobiological and epigenetic changes through the HPA axis. They also are not destiny. So even with epigenetic changes, so this is kind of stress biological changes based on your trauma responses, they can turn on and off depending on your environment. And in fact, children that have these kind of highly receptive epigenetic genes are more likely to benefit from intervention than those that don't. So it's actually a kind of what's the opposite to a double-edged sword? It can be terrible, but it can also be really positive. So they benefit more from interventions. The emotional dysregulation is really a key thing, and we see that right across life. Children that don't learn how to manage their own emotions from those very early days grow up to be people that don't know how to manage emotions. Now, there is stress and pressure for everybody. It's impossible to eliminate that. So what we need to do is make sure that us as a society have ways of coping that don't require violence. Oh, 5 minutes, okay. And trying to change or enhance our emotional regulation is really important. And of course, the disrupted relationships, which we've kind of touched on already. The other thing is the learning principles, and this is why violence gets worse over time, is it actually is reinforcing for the people that use it. Often it tends to work. It will get the actions that they're looking for, and they get this kind of physiological sense of satisfaction from the release of the stress. And it actually is rewarding in the sense that they feel this sense of power. So that kind of cascades. All right, back to my pet focus, corporal punishment, and why it's more important than just reducing smacking kids. We know that parents that experience corporal punishment are twice as likely and even more likely to hit their own children and more likely to believe it's necessary. So we've done research about that. We know corporal punishment is the most common form of violence globally. But here's what we're starting to see. We've just preparing a paper for Lancet Public Health at the moment. Corporal punishment is associated with a 19% increase in the use of intimate partner violence. We've always thought that it would increase the risk of subsequent victimisation, but getting hit as a child, just because you've done something wrong, not physical abuse, actually increases your risk of perpetrating violence to someone else. So when we're thinking about what do we need to do, it's not just that it hurts kids, it's not just that it's wrong, it's that it contributes to this intertransmissional cycles. All right, I've got two kind of final slides that try to put all of this together, and I kind of don't really like these in the sense that they're overly simplistic. It suggests that there's a nice, neat linear pattern. Child abuse disrupts developmental regulation. Children are then more likely, looking at the blue, to engage in the adolescent risk pathways. They then become engaged in violence and criminality as an adult and are therefore more likely to perpetrate it on their children. But this doesn't always go in this road. People can jump correctly from or directly from kind of dysfunctional disruption of attachment in childhood straight through to, I'm generally an okay person, I'm not engaged in delinquency, I've never been arrested, but I hold these norms and beliefs and attitudes that violence is okay, or that I'm more important because I'm a male, or I'm the head of the family, or I haven't actually just learned how to handle my own dysregulation and frustration. So it's a nice kind of slide. This is Kathy Whittam's work in terms of cycles of violence. It's definitely worth reading into. But what I really want to highlight is there are opportunities for intervention across the board there. So PPP positive parenting program has been shown to reduce population level rates of maltreatment, which I've said links with later violence, if it's implemented at a community level. This is not the people that do the intervention get better. This is the whole community has lower rates of maltreatment. So there's contagion effects of people engaging in positive parenting. Trauma and responsive care and healing. Kids that have violent experiences, that actually get support, that have people that care about them at school or extended family or in aunties and aunties and community, they actually do better than those that have the exact same experiences but don't have those kind of protective factors. And then even once we're kind of looking at people that are engaging in violence, there are opportunities in terms of diversion programs. I also mentioned restorative justice, Sarah, and how do we change pathways? It's harder the longer you leave it, but it is possible. I'm going to kind of skip over this just to put it all together. if you haven't already read Bronfenbrenner's socio-ecological model, you absolutely do need to be reading that. This kind of situates the person. It was developed originally as the child, but we can think about the person using violence in the centre, and then the cascading impacts of the people in their lives, the systems in their lives, the culture that surrounds them. And all of those things kind of interact with each other. And then the chronosystem on the outside, of course, is what I've been talking about with the impact of time and changes over that period. So that's what we know. We know a lot. What we don't know is we don't have a lot of evidence of what actually can disrupt those cycles. I've talked about things that we know disrupt the risk factors for intergenerational violence, but we have less evidence on what changes intergenerationally, these kind of 2-3 generation pathways. We don't know necessarily, we don't have good evidence of which pathways are most important. So if we're thinking, how do we balance our minimal resources, we need to really know which ones are most critical. How much does changing the law about coercive control make a difference versus how much does public health education versus how much does reducing that person's risks in the first place make a difference? Not enough about protective factors and post-traumatic growth. And as I've said, how do we actually engage governments to do something and to do better? We are working on systems to try and change this. And I really admire you, Winifred, for taking this multidisciplinary approach, because even today, Sarah and I have come at this from completely different angles, but it's just synergistically works. And so this is a really important piece of work, and I would encourage people that are online to read the paper. It's free on OSF, so that's the plug for that. Otherwise, I'm getting the wind up, so I'm going to stop and pass back over to you, Winifred.
Oh, thank you, Divna. Please join me, everyone, in applauding our two speakers. And I'll also put that DOI link in the chat in a moment. But before I do that, I'll just invite you, Sarah, to speak to the reflections and thoughts that you have as you listen to Divna's presentation. And then, Divna, you'll reflect a little more on Sarah. And if you want to stop screen sharing, we can see Sarah again.
Thanks so much, Divna. That was a magnificent presentation that I got so much out of, and it made a lot of sparks fly in my mind. Many of the descriptions that you provided there resonate so strongly with the powerful interventions research that I did with the qualitative research with people who have had lived experience of interacting with the justice system. And they described what they felt. We asked people, what would you like instead of a system that's based on, law and police and prosecutors? And one image that stayed in my mind is one respondent said, instead of the sound of the police siren, we want the sound of the ambulance coming to help everybody. And I think that speaks to those descriptions that you were saying around the causal indicators or causal factors that are being explored in these different contexts as being an experience. The concept of intergenerational violence is an experience that everybody needs healing from. And it reminded me of some of the legal innovations that we've developed in other areas, including areas of disability and sexual harassment recently, where we're beginning to understand through a dignity-based model the concept that every one of us experiences or could place ourselves on a continuum of abilities, a continuum of gender perhaps, a continuum of lived experience that enables us to recognise a corresponding responsibility or duty, if you like, to make adjustments to the way that we behave and approach things so that everybody can experience that concept of dignity. And I think that the parenting programs that you're talking about invite that kind of idea that this is, if we're thinking of intergenerational violence, it's a responsibility that's shared among everyone, and it's also something we can all participate in the healing of if we're given the opportunity to do that. And if we're divorced from this constant binary around blame that you and I both consider to be, a barrier that we, and I want to take care to distinguish that from accountability, which we both, I think in our slides in different ways, acknowledge as being central to have accountability for action, and then that leads to change. But if we want to get families and justice systems and the state to think differently about this, we have to spread out that experience to something that all of us can begin to understand and participate in. And so if we think about how we've got a law that says everyone needs to make a reasonable adjustment in their workplace or their restaurant so that people with different mobility can enter, or now we have a law saying every place of work has a positive duty to prevent sexual harassment by thinking about the way that they might conduct meetings or set up different oversight models, or how different people might go to work together, how they might get there, that kind of thinking about these problems diffuses that binary. And I was really struck with how your work feeds into that. But also your work reminded me of the power of the law. And I can really see that the evidence case that you've been able to prosecute for normative and legislative change is so compelling. And so I was really impressed by your ability to, on the one hand, spark a whole lot of new ideas, and on the other hand, remind me of the value of continuing to pursue legislative reform. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah. Those are great reflections. Divna, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Look, I've got lots of things.
Sorry, let me just jump in and say we are continuing to have tech issues, but as part of that, Divna, everyone online can't actually see you. So would it be possible for you to shift down towards where Christine is? That's where the camera starts. Yeah. You're just edging in, and now we can see your coffee, but not, and your hand. Could you please come down further? There. Okay. And our camera even pivoted.
So I can still see Sarah. Yes. Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Look, I just think it's so exciting that we have lawyers and psychologists and in the same room. And I spent 5 years in the QT law department, which really highlighted to me the value of law in this space. You know, I'd come originally from a very clinical point of view, and that work at QT and also your work really just highlights how big a potential we have for laws to make a difference. And so on one hand, there was a huge amount of hope, but the other hand, I was frustrated, and I continue to be frustrated by the limitations of the law. And I understand that it has to be an isolated act, and I understand all of that, but it just, there's a tension there that's frustrating. And it's interesting you mentioned later the coercive control laws, because you know, that's a huge case, that a huge kind of area that's changing, because it's no longer just about that single act. And I was talking to some people at the Queensland Police Force recently about the impact of coercive control. And when it was first getting suggested, there were some academics, even in the DFE space, that were really against it, because what happens at the moment is that victims are often assigned by police as the perpetrators. And so there's a huge concern about, are these victims, and particularly the kind of Indigenous women, going to get pulled up on these coercive control laws, and it's going to be more detrimental rather than beneficial. So I'm very excited to see kind of how that plays out. And it was really interesting to talk with him about what they're aware of and the training that's happening along those lines, and how they're able to look at those patterns of behaviour. But you still have the evidence threshold. And I think for me, part of the challenge with the law is the evidence thresholds are so much higher than the risk thresholds. So in the case that this colleague was telling me about, he said, we could catch him. She'd been saying it forever, but the reason we were able to catch him on these coercive control laws is 5 years ago, he sent her a list of what she needs to do every morning, all for him. And then there was another text like years later, and so that it established the pattern. And so I think one of the challenges that we have is the different systems have different thresholds for evidence and risk. And we see it also in child protection. So the blue card system, for example, works very well if somebody is actually arrested or convicted. most perpetrators of child sexual abuse are not ever brought to the attention of police. Ashley Paul Griffith in Queensland perpetrated for 20 years. He had a blue card the entire time. And our system review said he was meant to. According to the laws of the blue card regulatory, he was meant to have that. But the police had evidence, but not threshold evidence to convict him. So parents are going to talk to him. They're saying we're really concerned. Centres are moving him on. And so I think my takeaway from your session, Sarah, was the law absolutely has a place, but how we need to work it together. So the thresholds for evidence that are higher, as they absolutely should be, to meet a prosecution and then get someone struck off the blue card, should not be the same as what we assess risk. And it's the same for domestic and family violence. So we're arguing that government need to investigate or implement a separate risk strategy. So if somebody is moved on repeatedly, or people have made repeated reports to the police that someone has sexually abused my child, they can be struck off childcare even without actually having a criminal conviction. And we see that kind of same challenge of risk versus evidence in DFV cases, which is why we have so much. My final comment for you is I 100% agree with the accountability, and the law plays a role with that. And you talked in your reflection about accountability and healing and how that can make a difference. So victims can start, or the accountability of the perpetrator can help with the healing through restorative justice and things. But I would add to that the law has a really significant role to play in the prevention. And so, I've talked about child maltreatment, but even broader things like the gambling laws or the alcohol laws and things like that. We know that there's always a spike in domestic violence when there's state of origin and those kind of things. So laws around that also that don't seem to be directly related to violence, I think have a place in the system's response, which just highlights how messy it is, because it's not here's law and here's child protection and here's intervention services. They have to kind of interweave together, and that's where it comes back to this systems mapping and how do we get the systems to dialogue and interconnect to prevent and react or respond.
Well, thank you so much, Divna. And I know that there'll be a lot of expert people in the room. I can see some on my screen, including Sonia. We put our authors on the mapping in alphabetical order, but Sonia Barham, I might come to you in a minute for your reflections. As well, I invite everyone online to put their questions into the chat. And just while you're doing that, I realized there's a couple of things I forgot to do. I believe I was meant to introduce this project at the start, which I'm sorry I did not. So those of you that know the lab know that we're interested in norm change, social change, system change. And this project was a very happy outcome of a number of us getting rejected on a grant application. So we had put in a grant application and we talked about system change and what would be necessary steps, including increasing systems literacy, which I really like that use of the term that you guys came up with. And after we got knocked back, Sarah came to Christine and I and said, look, we could do the first part. So this report, Barham et al., is the first part where we got together a number of trusted colleagues with, cumulatively hundreds of years of experience working in this space. And we just all got together our understanding of what causes intergenerational violence. And although we focused a little bit on perpetrators who are individuals, we did extend to look at state actor violence, including the police, colonization, the military, and the way that veterans and their families become, triggered or put on trajectories of intergenerational violence through harm doing and by systems. And we talked about a great deal about toxic service provision and the role of state actors, whether it's education, which also used to have corporal punishment in the old days, or that teaching dehumanizing attitudes towards Indigenous peoples or sexist attitudes towards women, homophobia, faith. Our report went very wide. So I'll be curious to know, if you do read it, if you haven't read it before, what your thoughts are. Nobody's putting any questions into the chat that I can see. So did anyone want to ask a question? We often ask a student to ask the first question. And let me just look at the participant list and see if I can get a sense of whether there's any students whose names I recognize. Let me see. I don't want to call you out on this sensitive topic if you don't want to ask a question, but if you are a student, we normally would give room to you. And if not, I'll go over to you, Sonia, and ask for your reflections and your questions for these speakers.
Thank you, Winifred. Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Divna, and thank you, everybody. Gosh, I'm a little bit underprepared, but in terms, it's just a fascinating intersection, as you pointed out, Divna, of the law and the social sciences, of which psychology obviously is your remit, and but also I would include wider the social sciences. Now, I'm a practitioner working within family law with perpetrators mostly, and have stints in court as an expert witness around that very thing, accountability. And it's just such a huge topic that the mapping has pulled it all together. So we see the enormity of it, I think. And that presents us with several challenges as well as opportunities. I certainly have a question around this idea around children witnessing violence in the home. And in a broader, I guess, family experiential sense, as people go through their lives, what I do find that we need to, tricky in that we need to have some more language around is ideas of children maybe witnessing coercive control or violence in the home. However, they're not witnessing it against any understandings that they might have of what they're witnessing. So I think that we need to, certainly in practice, as I'm speaking to children, and today I'm going to be speaking with a mother who they've been referred to me for reunification therapy. And it's really an attempt of the court to try everything that they possibly can in order to get estranged parents to be connecting with their children. And it's a very, very admirable action. However, when I will be talking to some of the children, I might be feeling an awareness of lived experience and knowing that for these children in their lives, they will be coming to understand in retrospect what they experienced as children, as violence, as dangerous, as risk. But in the moment, when I'm trying to say, engage them in questions about, what do they think about their dad, or what do they think about their mum, and what do they think about what kind of relationship they'd like to have, they can't think of the danger, they can't see risk, and they can't think of the future, their future selves. And I, as
just jumping in to allow the panel to respond to those rich points.
Yeah, go.
What do you make of that comment, Divna or Sarah? Do either of you want to speak first?
I'll go. I mean, I think you're exactly right that children have very little insight into what's happening at an objective level, but they still experience it at an experiential level. So they know that they may not know, for instance, that it's violence or that it's not okay, because of course these don't occur in isolation. There's also love and wonderful times for some children that you've got the kind of mismatch. But what we know is it still does have an impact. And I do worry about the retrospective trauma of going, I didn't realize at the time, but now I'm like, my family was very dysfunctional. And that's a very common experience in child protection. We'll say the same thing is children will defend that, oh no, they just had a domestic, they'll say. And what they're describing is actually quite extreme violence where the children had to go outside or call the police, which they routinely do. So it's a bit of a tricky issue where what they say, that the language that they have to articulate it is different to what we would say as professionals. And I think you're touching on the fact that we don't want to put words in their mouth. We want to just ask them their experiences, but we have that added layer of interpretation that's challenging for us, I think.
Yeah, it's almost like to label is to stigmatize. What's your thought, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the other pieces of work I've done is on this concept of children as citizens now. And I mean, I feel very trepidatious even answering the question because of the expertise that you both have. And so I'll answer it from a strange angle, but that is that in that work around children as citizens and what we might need to change in our systems to give full citizenship in a political and legal sense to children, I think has made me question whether the type of system that you're finding yourself in, that child is finding themselves in, does not recognize that child fully in the same way that it does the adult. And that's not to suggest that you don't as the individual. It sounds like you absolutely do. So please don't take this as some kind of critique of your practice, as the opposite. I think what I'm trying to say is that we have a lack of imagination or innovation around how to treat a child as a fully autonomous person with rights. And if we did that, then we would realize that the position that you're in and that the child's in, and their ability to communicate anything meaningful to the state that's making such a significant decision about their life, it's not functioning. And so I think that then we get a situation where there has to be a compromise, and the compromise usually falls on a safety lens from my outside standpoint without the expertise that you have. And to me, there's a fine line between a safety lens and a paternalistic lens. And the difference between those two lenses seems to be the actual individuals involved in decision-making, their individual psychologist, the individual judge, the individual minister, or whoever it is, because they have to placate, they have to pull out from the system to create something that's human, rather than it being centered on the idea of the child as a full autonomous citizen. So that's an abstract academic-y kind of answer. It sounds like there's perhaps about 5 other practical things we could do to make it better, but I'm really interested in pushing that space open more.
Yeah, and I think for me as a scholar of collective action, I see your question, Chris, and I'll come to it. It also brings to mind the question of awareness raising. So in order to be able to engage like a problem or grievance, there's often a period of like meaning making, which is collective, where we come up with a label. Frank, I see your question too. That's great, and I'll come to it. And we have to do that to be able to identify what is the problem even before we can go to solutions. So that awareness raising that doesn't involve the child, inherently is always going to be flawed from the perspective of a collective action or group scholar, because it places the child in that powerless position rather than imagining that they are part of the group. But at the same time, we need to recognize that that can protect a child, and so that's a tension that I'm not familiar how to engage. Chris?
So my question is somebody who doesn't know anything about this topic. The question I had, and it's not to sound provocative, but something I'm really curious about. What about countries and cultures where it's just everybody hits their child? Are these societies more dysfunctional on a societal level? Because I mean, throughout history, and like you mentioned it as abuse, and I think that that's fair, but it means that in a lot of countries, everybody abuses their children.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, we did quite a bit of work in Kenya, and in Kenya, very violent discipline is the norm. Parents will openly say, "I beat my child," and they're proud of it because they are wanting to instill respect and values, and that's how they think they need to do it. I would argue that still has detrimental impacts. We still see very high levels of intimate partner violence, so that the violent beliefs are still inculcated in that. And what we see in law change, and it's happened in Kenya, it's happened in a number of other countries, is once that law changes, two things can happen. One, nothing. The other is if it is paired with public health campaigns, we start to see dramatic change. So in Sweden, for example, where they had the first banning of corporal punishment, no one would basically hit their child in public. However, what we still do see is high levels of intimate partner violence reported. And so what the argument is there is it could be that it hasn't actually had flow-on effects. That's true. But it could also be that it is opening the idea that violence is not okay. And so you're seeing the reporting of things that would not otherwise have been reported. So, that final slide where it's like, we don't actually know what the impact of some of these happens there.
And also that there's generational change, just jumping in, because I often tell this story, but a couple of years ago, I was interviewed by a young woman who asked me, had I experienced sexual harassment in the workplace? And I just laughed. I said, every woman my age has experienced sexual harassment in the workplace. I believe that's true. I mean, maybe it's wrong. Every woman in her 50s has experienced sexual harassment in the workplace. The only variability is whether you were sexually assaulted. And so as the norms change, the reporting of the deviant or criminal behavior should be seen as a victory. Sarah, what are your thoughts? It's great to see we have some other questions, but what are your thoughts on Chris's question? You might need to unmute. I'm not sure. You're not coming up on my screen. Oh, or did we lose Sarah? That's right. Sarah had to start walking to the graduation. Frank?
Thank you, Present. This was a great talk. I really enjoyed it. Well, enjoying is not maybe the right word, but very impressive work and important work, of course. Like Chris, I'm not an expert in this field at all. So my interest in this topic is more from personal experiences. I happen to be one of the 60% of people who have experienced violence on a regular basis, early childhood, later in life, both overt violent forms, but also a more psychological violence, although I didn't recognize it at the time. But my question is more about, and I noticed a gendered audience here, right? It's more women than men, as often is the case. And that kind of fired a question in my mind about, are we at risk of this becoming too much perceived as a women's/child problem? Rather, right? And therefore kind of letting men off the hook, right? They can sort of ignore the problem. And trying to connect my own experiences with that particular issue, I'd be, for example, happy to take part in studies and be a participant, being interviewed and asked about my experiences. I'd be happy to be that. So that's an offer that I can extend here. But I think it's also important to get men in the frame here, right? Highlighting their experiences, understanding their experiences, how they may have become perpetrators, how they may have intercepted that and prevented that from becoming perpetrators themselves. And I think part of those conversations that could be brought in to get away a little bit from the this is a women's problem risk, right? And meanwhile, we can also learn from these experiences and build some knowledge around preventative strategies that I'm sure that work already happened. So I don't want to sound patronizing or condescending, but that's
no. Thank you so much for sharing. I think that's such an important point. Divna?
Look, I'm very excited to hear men talking about this being an issue for everybody. We have a national strategy to reduce violence against women and children, and I 100% agree we need to have that. But I do think it's important that we recognise that this is not the only areas that people experience violence, and that in fact we're seeing more and more men coming out and saying, I've experienced this. In children, it's fairly equal. The only areas that women or girls are more likely to experience abuse is particularly sexual abuse and sometimes physical abuse. But the impact of that over life, I think, is much more focused on women. And I agree it shouldn't really be. We need spaces. What I would say is there is a movement among the sector to recognise the value of male voices, and particularly in male attitudes and how they are influenced by their experiences. So there are more and more male advocates of sexual abuse and physical abuse speaking out. One of them, in the law context, has just had a change, Harrison James, where he campaigned to have the good character laws revoked. So he was sexually abused and has argued that law shouldn't take into account that someone's otherwise a good person, except for this serious violence. So that's now no longer taken into account. So absolutely, there are people campaigning and there are people working, and I 100% agree it's not a gendered issue and it shouldn't be a gendered issue. But at the same time, recognising that there are more women that are impacted, and so we have to kind of take that nuanced lens.
Yeah. And Kiara, I want to make room for you before we go, but just to say thanks again, Frank, for sharing. Really appreciate it. Kiara, if you're there.
Yeah, yes. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I had a couple of things. Sarah mentioned briefly about transformative justice approaches, and I know from talking to providers in particular that they've highlighted issues with trying to get that sort of justice and even accountability through the legal system. So, like, what was explained to me is the idea that because the legal system, the best outcome the perpetrator can get is if they engage very adversarially and they essentially try to minimize the harm they've caused, undermine the victim, and like assassinate their character, which kind of not only furthers that harm aspect, but also is very distinct from that accountability that you're actually looking for. And I was wondering if you had thoughts on like where in our multifaceted system that accountability and transformative justice for healing approaches would be best placed. And also, Divna, I don't know if you may be familiar already, but do you know the Centre Against Domestic Abuse for the Moreton Bay region? Because they've got this program where they are working with young people who are using violence. And I thought, yeah, that was just a really cool, interesting program. Most of their clients they work with are people who have had experiences of family violence in their households growing up, and they're now using that, and they work with them to try and find resolutions. And a lot of it is about restoring those relationships and that attachment, particularly to like non-offending parents. So I was wondering if you had thoughts there.
I haven't heard of them particularly. I know they're a lot doing good space. I'd love to hear more though, so feel free to email me if you've got a website or something so I can look into it further or connect on LinkedIn. I've just offered the same thing. There's more and more being done, and I think the recognition of violence and particularly the recognition of the value of the voices of those that have lived through it and how that should inform our work, our policies, and our research is a really exciting step. And I think anything that's doing that is valuable.
That's so true. And, I'm also one of the 62% that I've experienced, child violence. And I guess I think we need to look at that intersectionality as well, as you mentioned, Frank, I think the majority of people that experience violence can escape it. I'm just going to say that as a declarative, but Divna's nodding, so I'm going to take it as evidence-based. And so I think that's really important, but also the culture change, right? So Divna, you alluded to this idea that in order to escape this system of widespread violence usage, we need to see culture changes. And I guess that's partly the interest of our group and many social psychologists here that work in system change. So my understanding of how that happens, how you get the government to do that law change, is that you have to change the laws in all the little constituencies that inform the policymakers. And that's why it's so painfully slow. So we often like to talk about the suffrage movement, which even if you just look at the moment of voting, the first countries to allow women to vote were Australia and New Zealand in the 1890s. And that has taken more than 130 years and still not reached all of the world, but it has gone through most of the world. And if you look at the countries and the changes, who came first and so on, it's clear that it spread through trust networks. So trust networks in English-speaking world into, Britain and Canada, but also trust networks, interestingly, through communism. So the communist countries moved more quickly. So I think we need to think about you know, when we think about the criminalization of children, for example, to me, that's an example of state violence where people that maybe are positioned as deserving it are exposed to, you know, physical harm, substance use, mental illness through the prison system. That's a kind of harm doing I think of as belonging in this conversation. I mean, not everyone might agree. And so the question is, why, we all in this room probably trust the science of perpetration, but some people don't trust, and those are informing the politicians. So how can we go through a chain of trust and really convince the people that haven't yet been convinced? And I'm conscious that we have 4 minutes, and actually I'm reminded that in the academic hour, we're supposed to finish at 10:02, and we hear rustling in the hall here. So does anyone else want to have the last word? Maybe I'll go to you, Divna, because Sarah's left the room. So final thoughts?
Look, I think my final thoughts would be there's hope.
Yeah.
The very fact that there is this group and there are people here and beyond in all of our networks working to try and reduce violence at all its levels and it's all its presentations and it's all its context is enormously exciting. And, you know, looking at how we've gone with the vote and thinking about how we could do that with violence, where do we go from here?
Exactly. Yes, well said. All right, please join me in a round of applause for Divna and Sarah, although not here.